What comes to mind when someone says flying saucer? Obviously, the first things that one would think about are aliens, extraterrestrials. The saucer-shaped UFO is definitively iconic of the culture. Depicted in art, science fiction, on book covers and t-shirts, it is instantly recognizable as a depiction of an alien spaceship. However, one may also be thinking about saucer craft made by sources we are well aware of, like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Yes, there has long been a buzz in the UFO community about man-made flying saucers. Supposedly inspired or, depending on who you ask, directly copied from actual extraterrestrial craft. These man-made saucers are often referred to as A.R.Vs, or Alien Reproduction Vehicles. One could imagine that the Avro car, developed by Avro Canada, or the M200G Volantor, developed by Mahler International, were absolutely influenced in their design by the pop culture image of the flying saucer. The M200G even had a glass dome surrounding its cockpit. These were disc-shaped craft that used fans to raise the craft a meter or two off the ground, and they could be maneuvered in all directions once they reached that height. In other words, these were early hovercraft. However, there are those who believe that man has created saucers as a direct result of studying alien technology. Saucers that were more than hovercraft, and could allegedly defy the laws of gravity. A bold claim, though not an uncommon one in the history of pseudoscience. One of the most famous examples is a man named Mark McCandlish, an aerospace illustrator who has worked with many U.S. aerospace corporations. McCandlish claims that through one of his friends and colleagues, Brad Sorenson, he was able to obtain, or more accurately to reproduce, schematics for an A.R.V. which was allegedly named the Fluxliner. As the story is told, McCandlish, who has been working as a conceptual aerospace artist, was contacted by a former schoolmate named Brad Sorenson. Sorenson had worked at a design firm, but had become independently wealthy through a patent securing business. The nature of their work led to their talking about aerospace design, and the two decided to meet and attend an air show at Norton Air Force Base in Southern California. Through some convenient ex machina, McCandlish ended up being called by the magazine Popular Science and given a very strict deadline for an illustration, so he was unable to attend the air show himself. However, Sorenson still attended and allegedly brought an ex-Secretary of Defense with him. This is a relatively convenient point in his story, having an officially unnamed, unconfirmed person who has held such a high position of authority as a witness to, and facilitator of, the more outrageous parts of this story. Allegedly, during a demonstration by the Thunderbirds, a well-known Air Force demonstration team, Sorenson's guest, who McCandlish has speculated was actually Frank Carlucci, tapped him on the shoulder and told him that there was something he wanted to see. He took them to a hangar, one which was being used to show off exhibits that were for those with high security clearance only. Apparently, the security at this secret high security clearance exhibition immediately took Sorenson to be Carlucci's aide. In an alleged quote to Sorenson, Carlucci says, "There are a lot of things in here that I didn't expect they were going to have on display, stuff you probably shouldn't be seeing, so don't talk to anybody." Apparently, there were craft immediately on display. Old model B-52s which were never declassified, other vehicles which were designed to deliver nuclear payloads that never saw the light of day. However, the most controversial thing that Sorenson claims to have seen were behind a thick black curtain which divided the hangar in two. According to McCandlish, when Sorenson and his guest were brought behind the curtain and the lights were turned on, there in the hangar were 3 flying saucers, and they were floating. Sorenson states that there was no sound, no cables suspending them, the saucers were just hovering. However, to McCandlish, the most important part of the story was next to the hovering craft, because allegedly, there were cutaway illustrations which seemed to detail how the craft worked. This is how McCandlish claims to have schematics and blueprints for A.R.Vs. Sorenson went over the details with him, and he reproduced the drawings described. These are the results. Sorenson claims that these drawings are as close as possible to the drawings that he saw in the hangar at Norton Air Force Base that day. McCandlish has since made a career of touring and giving lectures about the saucers, giving what he claims is his best guess as to how they work. From here on out, the story enters complete speculation. Abandon all assumption of fact, ye who enter here. McCandlish first mentions structures that are meant to support a crew, like the oxygen tanks that were providing the air to the crew compartment or the cockpit. There were little baubles on the outside dome of the cockpit, each allegedly housing a sensor which allowed the crew to navigate based on sight. There was even a small robotic arm, assumedly for some sort of sample collection. He claims that the bottom of the bell of the craft houses a precisely machined large capacitor array, and that the top of the bell houses an antenna, made from large coils of wire. Both the coils and the capacitors were suspended in an insulating medium. The central column of the craft was referred to as the amplifier, and according to Sorenson, it was the most secret part of the entire construction. He said that he didn't know much about it, but that it used mercury. McCandlish speculates that the central column is some sort of magneto-hydrodynamic apparatus. It uses the voltage from the capacitors through the antenna coil in order to move mercury and turn a flywheel. Magneto-hydrodynamics is a process by which electromagnetics can influence the flow of liquids. In short, fluid exposed to an electromagnetic current will flow with that current. It is apparently this principle which generates the forces to turn the flywheel. The flywheel, he claims, is a homopolar generator, which uses centrifugal force to direct electrons to be collected by a brush or similar structure elsewhere in the craft. The propulsion system of the craft, according to McCandlish, was capitalizing on something called zero-point energy. In his descriptions of zero-point energy, it sounds like he is describing what scientists would go on to call the Higgs field. The idea, again allegedly, was to generate voltages so obscenely high that the resulting electromagnetic field would polarize space-time, compressing it in the direction that the craft was to travel and expanding it behind the craft. This warped space-time was supposedly used to propel the craft to near the speed of light. A bold, fantastic claim, led in the way that bold, fantastic claims usually are. He begins with a premise, and then he makes an assumption to suit the premise. Then, based on that assumption, he continues to build and build until suddenly he is claiming far more than the original premise. He also seems to have some knowledge of electromagnetics and magneto-hydrodynamics. However, to claim so much of the central column of the structure based solely on Sorenson's claim that it involved mercury is hypothetical at absolute best and deliberately deceptive at worst. Being an aerospace illustrator, one might immediately think McCandlish would be a good person to translate schematics like this. It would lend to him a sense of credibility while talking about the subject, especially considering the story he provides for context. One who draws technical illustrations and schematics for U.S. aerospace corporations would certainly be able to verify the authenticity of, and even make sense of, the A.R.V. drawings. However, it is relatively unclear as to whether McCandlish ever drew schematics or technical drawings. His own website states that he is an aviation and conceptual artist. He says in his own words that he had to delve very deep into the research, and there were things that he couldn't understand and that he had to have summarized. Therefore, it can be assumed that he has no professional experience in either physics, aerospace engineering, or electronics. It would seem that he is literally an illustrator who happens to be commissioned to draw aircraft, apparently theoretical aircraft at times. It isn't even clear as to whether he had any experience with cutaway drawings, where he had to know the more specific details about how the aircraft functioned. In all, there are many red flags that should lead you to be very skeptical of Mark McCandlish and his claims. Could it be that Mark's claims are true? Has he, with the help of Brad Sorenson, recreated schematics to one of the most secretive aircraft known to mankind? In his words, the goal of the craft is to create extremely high voltages leading to equally impressive magnetic fields which lead to the manipulation of space-time itself. The mechanics of the craft, from what we can see, could hypothetically produce high voltages. The schematic, at face value, has many components that are reminiscent of a Tesla coil. The capacitor array is a place where high voltages are stored. In a Tesla coil, the capacitor discharges into the primary coil, through the resistance provided by a spark gap. Assumedly, there is a similar resistance between the capacitor array of the A.R.V. and the antenna coil. Assumedly, the capacitors in the A.R.V. discharge into the antenna coil, creating an electromagnetic field which resonates with the secondary coil around the central column, generating extremely high currents in that coil. This seems to be an open-air transformer, just like the one created by the primary and secondary coils of a Tesla coil. Among the reasons Tesla coils produce such high voltages, the differences begin here, as the central column apparatus containing the mercury and flywheel are completely absent in the Tesla coil. But assumedly, as McCandlish says, the current and electromagnetic field generated in the central column coil is used to generate motion to turn the flywheel. The flywheel, or homopolar generator, appears to be ancillary, meant to help control and collect stray charges. Based on observation of the schematics, one can probably safely assume that most of the components function as McCandlish describes. They seem to take a base charge and transform it into an extremely high voltage, so in that way, hypothetically, the craft would function as intended. It is beginning to look like there really is some credibility to McCandlish's story. Or at least there would be, if one were to stop there and go no further. Unfortunately, McCandlish requires yet another suspension of disbelief in order for one to conclude that his craft would work. He claims that the intense electromagnetic field produced by the central column of the A.R.V. warps space-time. Allegedly, it is this warping, compression of space ahead of the vehicle, expansion behind, that allows the craft to move at near light speed. Even here, there appears to be some kernel of truth. Electromagnetic fields do theoretically have some possibly quantifiable effect on gravity. This is an Einstein field equation expressing the effect of electromagnetism on the geometry of spacetime. The first portion expresses the geometry of spacetime, gravity, and the second portion expresses the factors contributing to that geometry. This portion represents a value called the energy stress tensor, which can be represented this way. This section of the equation is affected by the electromagnetic field tensor, represented here. This equation proves that, in short, yes, electromagnetism can have an effect on gravity. However, the contribution of electromagnetism to the aforementioned equation is not very direct or very large. It would take grotesquely strong electromagnetic fields to have an observable effect on gravity. Certainly nothing that could be produced on Earth by marine-style batteries and a vaguely described Tesla coil. So if all this may as well be nonsense, then what is the current state of anti-gravity and interstellar propulsion? Well, anti-gravity and artificial gravity have long been thought impossible according to the laws of physics. General relativity and conservation of mass are really all that are needed to dismiss the possibility of an anti-gravity device. It will take a true breakthrough, or past misunderstanding, in modern physics in order to allow the possibility. However, there have been developments in interstellar travel that, although not quite on the scale of bending space-time, show promise in propelling probes across great cosmic distances. A solar sail with very large surface diameter but comparatively low mass could use photons from starlight as a solar wind of sorts to propel the craft forward. One concept even proposes building a satellite laser array that would be aimed at the solar sail in order to push it in the right direction. The solar sail appears to be the best contender so far, as most propulsion systems either incorporate or depend on one. However, the solar sail is only estimated to achieve a speed of 150,000 miles per hour, a very far cry from the speed of light. It appears that if one wants to travel between the stars, one will have to settle for more worldly means of doing so than bending space-time. Unless, of course, there is something that modern physics is missing. Or perhaps something that modern physics is deliberately obscuring. Something that could allow lowly Earthlings to manipulate magnetic fields so magnificently mammoth that they could bend the very fabric of the universe and propel us into a new age of space exploration. We may never travel to the most distant stars, but we will certainly never know unless we begin trying. Thank you for watching and listening.